The generals who served under Soviet dictator Josef Stalin in what was so-called the Great Patriotic War were survivors of the purges of the 1930s. These led to the execution or dismissal of 720 out of 837 Soviet officers above the rank of colonel for supposed disloyalty to the regime. From June 1941, Soviet commanders had to cope not only with the massive invasion by the armies of Germany and its Axis allies, but also with Stalin's constant interference in decision-making and the severe risks involved in contradicting him. Yet Stalin finally had the sense to back generals who stood up to him, and by 1943 he was allowing them more autonomy. Konstantin Rokossovsky. Son of a Polish father and a Russian mother, Konstantin Rokossovsky fought for the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War and was a senior Soviet commander in the 1930s. When Stalin purged the officer corps, he was tortured and imprisoned. Rehabilitated in time for the Nazi invasion, he performed brilliantly in the defense of Moscow in 1941–1942. He commanded the Don Front Army Group that encircled German 6th Army at Stalingrad and then Central Front at the Battle of Kursk. In these battles and in Operation Bagration to liberate Belorussia and Eastern Poland, Rokossovsky frequently and fearlessly resisted orders he thought mistaken, whether from Georgy Zhukov or Stalin himself. In August 1944, he led the Soviet forces that were halted on the Vistula, not intervening as the Germans suppressed the Warsaw Uprising. His army group ended the war in North Germany. Afterwards, he became a member of the communist Polish government. Vasily Chuikov. Born into a Russian peasant family, Vasily Chuikov fought on the Bolshevik side in the Russian Civil War and became an officer in the Soviet army. Passing unscathed through Stalin's purges, he served as any army commander in the invasion of Eastern Poland in 1939 and the subsequent Winter War with Finland. Chuikov was fortunate to be abroad during the Nazi invasion of 1941, working as a military advisor to the Chinese nationalists, and thus avoided being implicated in the early Soviet disasters. He did not enter combat against the Germans until 1942. On 12 September, Chuikov was placed in command of the forces inside Stalingrad, with orders to defend the city or die in the attempt. Robust and ruthless, he stamped his personality on the battle. Soldiers were commanded to hug the Germans amid the ruins, staying so close to them they could not use airstrikes or artillery without hitting their own men. Anyone who showed the slightest reluctance to fight was shot. Contesting every inch of ground, Chuikov held Stalingrad and became a Soviet hero. Chuikov subsequently led 8th Guards Army through the campaigns that brought the Soviet forces into Germany in 1945 and was entrusted with the capture of Berlin, accepting the surrender of the city's garrison after some of the fiercest fighting of the war on May 2. Georgy Zhukov. Born into poverty, Georgy Zhukov was conscripted into the Russian Imperial Army in World War I. He fought for the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War and made a successful career as a Soviet officer, avoiding death or dismissal in Stalin's purges. In 1938, he commanded Soviet troops fighting a border war against the Japanese in Mongolia. In 1939, at Khalingol, he crushed the Japanese forces with aggressive use of tanks and motorized infantry. The prestige gained in this war earned Zhukov the post of Chief of the General Staff in January 1941. He did not welcome the job, seeing himself as a field commander rather than a staff officer. He openly disagreed with Stalin's response to the German invasion and his insistence on no retreat. Zhukov was dismissed in July 1941, but remained one of the inner circle running the war. In September, he was sent to hold Leningrad, which looked close to falling to the enemy. In fact, the Germans did not try to take the city, but Zhukov appeared to have saved it. The next month, Stalin asked him to repeat the miracle at Moscow. German forces advancing on the capital were first halted and then in December driven back with a well-handled counteroffensive. In October 1942, Stalin made Zhukov Deputy Supreme Commander and ordered him to save Stalingrad. Operation Uranus, the offensive that cut off the German army in the city, was methodically planned and rapidly and ruthlessly executed. showing Zhukov's skills at their best. In 1943, he masterminded the great Soviet victory at Kursk. Operation Bagration, the massive Belarusian offensive of the summer 1944, showed how Zhukov and other Soviet generals had by now mastered combining all arms to smash through enemy defenses, maintaining momentum across difficult terrain, and crushing resistance, whatever the cost in lives and material. Zhukov supervised the capture of Berlin in spring 1945 and ended the war as the most celebrated of Soviet commanders. Soon, demoted by jealous Stalin, he returned for a time as defense minister in the 1950s. Alexander Vasilevsky. Vasilevsky began his military career during World War I, earning the rank of captain by 1917. After the October Revolution of 1917 and the start of the Civil War of 1917–1922, he was conscripted into the Red Army, taking part in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919–1921. At the start of the 1943 Soviet counteroffensive of World War II, Vasilevsky coordinated and executed the Red Army's offensives on the Upper Don, in the Donbass, Crimea, Belarus, and the Baltic states, and in his war in Europe with the capture of Königsberg in April 1945. In July 1945, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Soviet forces in the Far East. He executed the Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation, August 1945. After the war, he became the Soviet Defense Minister from 1949 to 1953, a position he held until after Stalin's death in 1953. Ivan Konev. Born to a peasant family, Konev was conscripted into the Imperial Russian Army in 1916 and fought in World War I in 1919. He joined the Bolsheviks and served in the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. After graduating from Frunze Military Academy in 1926, Konev gradually rose through the ranks of the Soviet military. By 1939, he had become a candidate to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Konev took part in a series of major campaigns, including the battles of Moscow and Rzhev. Konev further commanded forces in major Soviet offensives at Kursk, in the Dnieper, Carpathian, and Vistula-Oder offensives. In February 1944, he was made a Marshal of the Soviet Union. On the eve of German defeat, Konev's first Ukrainian front was pitted against the armies of Georgy Zhukov in the race to Berlin. Konev was the first Allied commander to enter Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, after the Prague Uprising. He replaced Zhukov as commander of Soviet ground forces in 1946. In 1956, he was appointed commander of the Warsaw Pact armed forces and led the violent suppression of the Hungarian Revolution and Prague Spring.